You guys remember the Divergent series? A few days ago, I remembered that they were a thing suddenly. And I was like, well, I know what I'm doing tonight. So I reread Divergent and then re-skimmed the second book. So today I want to talk about those books, especially in the context of their YA era in comparison to The Hunger Games. And then go into some of the good and the bad, shall we? While I put on a full face of makeup. Now, pre-pandemic, I owned one tube of mascara, one expired brown eyeshadow, two lipsticks, and one blush. And like that had me totally covered. But I don't know about you guys. At the end of last year, all my normal coping mechanisms just weren't cutting it anymore. And I decided to try to buy happiness, which I don't endorse, but I also don't judge, in myself or anyone else. So now for the first time in my adult life, I have a drawer filled with makeup. And I found that I really don't care very much if it makes me look any better or any different from how I do now without any makeup on. It's more that it relaxes me some days to sit down and like go through all the steps. I don't know, it's just more of a fun thing than anything else. So let's do this. Potential spoiler alert for these books that came out a decade ago and that everyone has since forgotten. Especially before I started my channel, but in the years since too. When a book gets big beyond the world of books, I do pay attention to it, and I often end up reading those books because regardless of any like quality control issues or how good they might be, they just seem to be tapping into something of the moment, and I always want to try to figure out what that is. Sometimes they're helped along by things like an Oprah book club pick or a really buzzy adaptation, but not always. In the spirit of curiosity, I've read all four Twilight books, the original three Hunger Games, the first three Game of Thrones books, the Witcher books. Eat, Pray, Love falls into this category for me. I recently made a video talking about reading all eight Bridgerton books, so it crosses genres, but certainly in the past decade or so, a few of the biggest phenomena have been YA books, specifically The Hunger Games. And Divergent was, many would say shamelessly, playing into the appetite that The Hunger Games created and using a lot of its major set pieces. So they both have badass young women heroines who are living in post dystopian worlds, and they become the central figures in terms of like fighting the injustice of those worlds. Oh, and also in the Hunger Games, it's separated into 12 different districts. That's how people are controlled. And in Divergent, it's 5 different factions. The setup is that we're in a post-dystopian version of Chicago where that's all that's left of humanity, presumably in the beginning of the series. And there are 5 different factions within the city where people are separated based on their defining characteristic. And the 5 factions are abnegation, amity, candor, erudite, and dauntless. When citizens of these factions are 16 years old, they take an aptitude test that tells them which faction they belong in. But then they get to decide in a public choosing ceremony where they want to spend the rest of their lives. Our protagonist, Beatrice Triss Pryor, in her aptitude test results, she gets 3 of the factions. She gets erudite, dauntless, and abnegation, which is incredibly rare and is called being divergent, which means you can't be placed into one category. And she doesn't quite know why at this point, but being divergent is very dangerous and it's something she has to keep a secret. In her public choosing ceremony, she decides to leave abnegation and join the Dauntless faction instead. And a lot of the first book is her initiation into this really intense, reckless, violent faction and how she tries to fit in there. Okay, so I would be completely amazed if Veronica Roth, the author of the Divergent series, hadn't been really heavily, let's say, inspired by the Hunger Games. But I also think people can exaggerate the similarities, mostly because people have a tendency to exaggerate how unique The Hunger Games is as a series. Yes, The Hunger Games definitely has much better social commentary than a series like Divergent. But I think because there were these kind of knockoffs in the wake of Suzanne Collins' books. People are more willing now to overlook their flaws and the ways that they themselves are really derivative in the scope of the YA genre. So like the framing of the Capitol, that's not complicated. That's not interesting. And the villain is a man named President Snow. The love triangle, people. But I don't say these things as like an indictment of the Hunger Games, because I think the whole point of them succeeding was that they were the perfect mixture of old and new elements, of things that people already expected from this type of book, and then surprising things as well. Like nothing succeeds to that degree if it's really entirely new, I would argue. The thing that really set the Hunger Games apart was its grit and its violence. I had a book meeting once with the French editor of the Hunger Games, and he was the first one after the US to have bought the series. And he said it was a bear to get past his editorial board meeting, that his whole team was like really unsure of that book because they didn't know how to market it for a young adult audience at the time. It felt like it was taking a big risk. I think it's also relevant to think about the elements of the Hunger Games that have nothing to do with the books, but that have helped its general perception as like good YA, social commentary, dystopian, whatever, as like something that's seen as a pinnacle of those kind of genre components. And I think a big one is that it's a book that, although the protagonist was a woman, it appealed to both male and female readers, and so it was seen as more legitimate automatically than something like Divergent, which very heavily is going to skew female and also younger. Divergent is like really targeted at that audience group, whereas The Hunger Games is given more weight as a series because adults really, really resonated with it too. And I think those things are, to The Hunger Games' credit, and a reflection of its quality to some extent, but we should also be wary of thinking that because men like something and older people like something, that makes it more legitimate. So in the wake of this like trailblazing, world-selling phenomenon, we had a book from a young, I think she was a college student at the time, wasn't Veronica Roth? Didn't she write this while she was at Northwestern in the space of a few weeks? Or there's some kind of author story like that. We got Divergent as a result. And I first read these books back when the third book had just been published, in an uproar because it's awful. It's honestly like one of the worst conclusions to a series that I can think of. And we've had a lot of those in recent years, haven't we? So I first read these maybe 8 or 9 years ago. And this was my first reread, again, of just the first book now as, somebody closer to 30 than 20. And I want to play devil's advocate here first and talk about the things that I think work for this trilogy. And the major one is the faction system. Now, yes, I'm going to get into just how bad this world building is. It's one of the flimsiest examples that I can think of personally. But people love anything related to personality tests. Things like Myers-Briggs, 5-factor personality test, Enneagram, D&D character chart, astrological signs, Harry Potter houses. I mean, something that was essentially, are you a protagonist, smart, nice, or a Nazi? And somehow people still turn it into like a way to talk about themselves and seem interested in their own personalities, but like make it socially acceptable. That's what a lot of these personality test things are. And Divergent knows that, and it plays right into it. And I don't think it really pretends to be more complicated than it is, especially in the first book. It's set up so that its intended readers are going to be like, well, which faction am I in? And I recognize this as someone who, doesn't really care about a lot of the things I just talked about, like Myers-Briggs, Harry Potter, astrology, but still, like, your mind goes to that. There's that, like, egocentric part of most people that's going to be like, well, let me sort myself. I totally thought when I first read these books that I would be an erudite, and now I'm like, oh, candor. I obviously would be in Candor, the most boring, least developed faction that nobody cares about. You can bewail how derivative it is all you want, and it is, but it's because, again, it's tapping into something that people enjoy. Okay, the second thing is how it plays into its protagonist being special. Oh, we have a visitor here. A little buddy. Can I say hello? The mirror over here. She's very confused by her reflection, and she likes to go up to it and, you know, issue a challenge. Excuse me while I try and fail to remove all of the cat hair. Here's the thing. Many YA books, and adult books too, but especially YA, try to get away with threading the needle of having a protagonist who's somehow super special, but also just like everybody else. And I think that that's harder to achieve in a world that is, you know, of our time and place. But I actually really respect the hustle of Divergent to have just built that into the world. The whole world is built around the idea that this girl Triss is special because she's like a normal human. To me, there's a level of self-awareness and also temerity to that I admire in this project. And then I think that there are a lot of elements that people claim make it more of a Hunger Games knockoff, but that are just common to the genre generally, including in the Hunger Games. And like you could accuse the Hunger Games of the same thing essentially, because a lot of books Divergent included are trying to deal with the intensity of teenage feelings and the start of like first young relationships. That's actually always been to me what sets YA apart as a genre. It's not necessarily the age of the protagonist or, you know, the framing of the story. Most often it's the pacing and the pitch of the language that puts it in the YA category. As an almost 29-year-old, I can honestly say that the emotions I experience most intensely on a daily basis are frustration, resentment, and weariness. And I still experience anger, passion, joy, but these kind of primary color feelings are not really so much my daily bag, you know? Which is why a lot of YA, understandably, isn't for me anymore. Because it's just exploring things at such an intense level in a way that doesn't resonate anymore and is kind of exhausting to read. You know, in the past year or so, I read some of the Court of Something and Somethings, and that was what most stuck out to me, was the blaring register of it, where I was like, all right, everybody's feeling too much. But it works for its audience, and I think Divergent actually does this really well. Like, it deals with Triss trying to figure out the scope of her own anger, how and why she reacts to certain situations the way that she does, and also because she comes from a really conservative faction where modesty and being unassuming and quiet, not drawing attention to yourself, those were the things that were valued. When she's in a situation in this book where she is trying to be intimate with somebody for the first time, I think Veronica Roth draws that situation well. I do. And it's funny because this is the main thing that's much more compelling about Divergent than something like The Hunger Games is the love story, which I think is a decent love story. I'm not going to lie to you. People have different takes on the intentions behind the love triangle in The Hunger Games, if it was meant to actually be, you know, somewhat subverting tropes of the genre. Okay, I haven't used this eyeliner before, and it's supposed to be the creme de la creme of eyeliners. I'm nervous though. Okay. Oh, interesting. Okay. That's really very dark. Okay. Don't think this is totally working out for me. I'm really gonna have to practice with this one. Personally, I don't think that, you know, the fact that The Hunger Games has a lukewarm love trilogy is something in its favor. I think that comes from a place of people assuming that a book takes itself more seriously if love isn't a major factor. Worth interrogating why that is. I think just because you included something and didn't try that hard at it, that's not the same thing as actually subverting that general concept. And also, if you're going to have a high quality book, why not have all the components be high quality, including any romance you choose to have in it, regardless of whether or not it's a main focus. Okay, that's not Not good, but not terrible. And then last thing I'll say for it is that Divergent is trying to explore how concepts like selflessness, bravery, and sacrifice do and don't line up with one another. And it has some like fairly worthwhile commentary on that kind of thing, I'll say. It totally loses any worth in that commentary with its choices in the third book. Here's where we get to the crux of some of the issues that I think have kept this from, even now, being a series that's endured in people's imaginations. One of them is that it's a classic example of that most common of things, a book that's written in first person that should have just been third person. If your character's voice itself, not their personality, but if their voice is not interesting, just make it third person. And the whole time you're reading Triss's voice, you're just like, I mean, especially when the writing is clumsy, over-explanatory, that kind of stuff. It's not good if that is also meshing with your perceptions of the character herself, you know? And then, of course, the world building is a joke. It has holes the size of the Hoover Dam immediately. But I was sort of willing at the time and even now to overlook that, because if you just take the first book on its own, you can honestly view it as a sort of thought experiment, like truly on the level of a thought experiment where it's theoretical and it's not applicable to real life, and where you can almost argue that the book isn't pretending to be all that applicable to like what its readers are going to experience. Like, I don't think every world needs to be, maybe an unpopular opinion, especially for someone who loves fully fleshed out epic fantasy, but I don't think a world needs to be fully built in order for you to kind of like ride with it necessarily, depending on what you feel the author's intentions are and like if that was something that they even attempted, which in this case, I'm sure that in the years following, Veronica Roth was asked so many questions about this world that she's come up with responses, but it's inescapable when you're reading the books that you know the author didn't think about so many things. Like, how does money work in this world? You know, things related to geography and just basic like ecology, you know, like how can one of the Great Lakes have already been silted up in that few years? It doesn't make any sense, you know? And I think if you're going to write that kind of book, you have to own up to it and be like, yeah, these elements don't make sense. You're totally right. I just didn't think about it. I think instead the instinct for authors is to retroactively act like everything was more premeditated than it actually was. And the thing is, the arc of this trilogy gives the lie to that very generous interpretation of mine, that it's not a book that's really taking itself that seriously, because, oh boy, like it really does get to the point where it thinks it is making all sorts of commentary on the essence of humanity and genetics and those slipperiest of letters in the hands of the wrong author, D, N, and A. And it occurred to me for the first time that her mistake came in the very first book, even though that's the best of the trilogy and still a lot of fun to read, I think. It's because she packs too much into it. And although it works maybe for that book in some respects, it sets the rest of the trilogy up for failure. The first book, you have, you know, meeting our protagonist, getting to know her, all of her dauntless initiation stuff, her figuring out that they're on the brink of war, then the war starting, then both of her parents dying and her becoming like a key part of everything that's going on. And all of this is just, like I said, it's pretty packed. Now, it's easy to say this in retrospect, but what could have saved the series, I think, is to have made the first book into two and had the second book with a better ending be the third book. Hang on, I need to concentrate on this. My little baby. Just thought we'd have this quick little interlude while I move to a different location. This is the prime birding spot. Okay, here's the final look in slightly better lighting. So what I mean by what I was saying is that if the first book had just been dauntless initiation and ended with her becoming part of that faction, like she laid so much groundwork for us caring about the factions and like caring about Triss's role in her new one. And so I think she should have just written that way for the first book. And then the second book should have been stirrings of war. issues starting to emerge more with the faction system itself and within Dauntless. And then the climax of the second book could have been crazy things breaking out, parents dying, Triss being traumatized, all of that. And then the third book could have been the implications of the faction system being destroyed and everybody considering more if this is the kind of world they want to live in. It just feels like even if somebody doesn't put a lot of effort into world building, if you as the reader have come to care about something, even if it's as stupid as the faction system, to set all that up within one book and then dismantle it and then kind of continue dismantling it and ruining it over the course of 2 more books. It's just the whole pacing of the series was off. And I can see how maybe for the publisher, like receiving Divergent, the first book, in their inbox and thinking, wow, this is at breakneck pace. And yeah, that this is what readers want, that they want things to escalate really quickly. They want things to be as violent as possible and as real as possible super quickly. But I think that was a wrong calculation in this case. Lindsay Ellis has like a feature-length series on what went wrong in Game of Thrones. And something she said at the end of it really struck me. It was that the worst thing you can say for a series ending is that it makes you feel stupid for having cared about the rest of the series. Beyond Game of Thrones, which is maybe the most famous example at this point, you have series like Pretty Little Liars, How I Met Your Mother, that have really been accused of the same thing by their fan bases. And Allegiant is also, for anyone who experienced it like I did, it is a prime example of this phenomenon, that it's not just that the ending is bad in and of itself, it's that it makes you feel foolish for having invested any of yourself in any of the series or cared, even if you barely cared in the first place. It makes you feel stupid for any amount of caring, any amount of thought or interest that went into it. So in that sense, I think that this series is a cautionary tale. But again, I can admit to myself that maybe in a few years' time, I'll reread the first book because it's fun. It's just fun for me. And I don't care that it's not good and then it's not even all that interesting. It hits beats that I'm expecting, and some of the character things are insightful, and like, that's enough in certain moods, you know? Let me know any of your thoughts on the Divergent series, the Hunger Games, big YA franchises in general, and your relationship to them, if you have any at all. If you tend to pick up zeitgeisty books just to see like what everybody is talking about, like I do sometimes, I would love to hear about any of that. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you soon, probably for a very different video.